The chrome bumper of Pastor Michael's truck disappeared around the corner, chained to a tow truck driven by the woman who'd been terrorizing his congregation for months. She had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. What happened? Next would shake their small town to its core, and by Sunday's end, everyone would know exactly who had the last laugh. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Maple Street as Pastor Michael Chen pulled his weathered Ford F-150 into the narrow space between two cars. The truck's engine gave its familiar rumble before falling silent, and Michael sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts for the sermon ahead. Through the windshield, he could see the modest white steeple of Grace Community Church rising against the autumn sky, its bell tower a beacon for the faithful who would soon fill the wooden pews. Michael had been the pastor of this small congregation for 3 years now, ever since moving from the city to this tight-knit community of barely 2,000 souls. The transition hadn't been easy. City sophistication didn't always translate well to rural sensibilities, but he'd found his rhythm. His sermons struck the right balance between biblical truth and practical wisdom, and his genuine care for his flock had earned their trust and respect. He stepped out of the truck, adjusting his navy blazer and checking his watch. 8:30, the service wouldn't start for another hour. But Michael always arrived early to prepare, to walk through the sanctuary and pray over the empty pews that would soon hold his congregation. The crisp October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from chimneys already pressed into service against the morning chill. Michael breathed deeply, grateful for the peace of this moment before the day's responsibilities took hold. He grabbed his worn leather Bible and sermon notes from the passenger seat, then locked the truck with a practiced motion. "Excuse me." The sharp voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade. Michael turned to see a woman striding toward him with the purposeful gait of someone spoiling for a fight. She was perhaps 45, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every perceived slight and injustice in the world. Her mouth was set in a thin line that suggested smiling was a foreign concept. "Yes," Michael replied, keeping his tone neutral. He'd learned in his years of ministry that sometimes the best response to aggression was calm patience. "You can't park there," she declared, pointing at his truck as if it were some offensive monument. To poor judgment, that's a no-parking zone. Michael followed her gesture, genuinely puzzled. He'd parked in the same spot dozens of times over the past 3 years, as had many of his parishioners. The street was lined with cars belonging to churchgoers, just as it was every Sunday morning. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. I've been parking here for years. Everyone does on Sunday mornings." "Well, everyone's wrong," the woman snapped. "I'm Karen Hutchinson, and I live right there." She jabbed a finger toward a pristine Victorian house across the street, its lawn manicured to golf course perfection. "I'm sick and tired of you people thinking you can just park wherever you want, blocking traffic and making noise at all hours." Michael glanced at his watch again. It was barely past 8:30 on a Sunday morning. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's rooster and the gentle murmur of early churchgoers greeting each other as they walked toward the sanctuary. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but I don't think we're causing any real disruption. The service is only—" "Don't you ma'am me," Karen interrupted, her voice rising. "I've called the city about this 3 times. 3 times, and nothing gets done because apparently nobody cares about the rights of homeowners anymore." Several early arrivals had begun to notice the confrontation. Michael recognized the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd been members of Grace Community since before he was born, walking slowly toward the church entrance. They glanced over with concern, whispering to each other. This was exactly the kind of scene Michael wanted to avoid, especially right before a service. "Look, Mrs. Hutchinson," Michael said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I certainly don't want to cause you any trouble. If there's really a parking restriction here, I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe we could talk about it after the service." Karen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, how convenient. Push it off until later. Hope I'll forget about it." That's exactly the kind of attitude I'd expect from someone who thinks they're above the law. The accusation stung more than Michael cared to admit. He'd built his ministry on the principle of humility, of being a servant leader who put the needs of others before his own. To be characterized as someone who thought himself above the law felt like a personal attack on everything he tried to represent. "I assure you, I don't think I'm above anything," Michael replied, his patience beginning to fray despite his best efforts. "I'm simply trying to understand what the actual problem is here." "If you could show me the specific regulation, I don't have to show you anything," Karen shot back. "What I'm going to do is call the city right now and have your truck towed. Maybe that'll teach you people some respect for private property." "Private property?" Michael looked around, confused. "This is a public street." "My property line extends to the curb," Karen declared, with the confidence of someone who'd looked up just enough legal terminology to be dangerous. "And I'm not putting up with this anymore." She pulled out her phone with theatrical precision, making sure everyone within earshot could see what she was doing. Several more churchgoers had gathered, drawn by the raised voices and the unusual spectacle of conflict on their normally peaceful Sunday morning. Michael recognized faces from his congregation: the Washingtons, the Kowalskis, old Mr. Peterson, who always sat in the third pew from the front. "Please," Michael said, lowering his voice in hopes that she would do the same. "Let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be. I'll move my truck right now if it'll help." But Karen was already dialing, her fingers stabbing at the phone's screen with vindictive satisfaction. "Too late for that now. You should have thought about being reasonable before you decided to argue with me." Michael felt his face flush with a combination of embarrassment and mounting anger. This woman wasn't interested in solving a problem. She was interested in wielding power, in making a point at the expense of his dignity and his congregation's peace. He could see the expressions on his parishioners' faces, some concerned, others beginning to show their own anger at the way their pastor was being treated. "Karen's towing," she said into the phone, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "I need a truck sent to 412 Maple Street immediately. There's an illegally parked vehicle that needs to be removed." The word immediately hit Michael like a physical blow to turn the other cheek, as Scripture commanded. But something about Karen's smug satisfaction, her obvious pleasure in creating chaos on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning, sparked something deeper in him. "You know what," Michael said, his voice finally carrying an edge that made several of his parishioners look up sharply. "You're absolutely right. I should have been more considerate. I should have realized that someone might have a problem with people gathering to worship God in their own community." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare try to make this about religion. This is about respect for property rights and following the law." "Of course it is," Michael replied, and now there was something in his tone that made even Karen pause. "And I'm sure you've been equally vigilant about every other parking violation on this street. I'm sure you've called to have every single person towed who's ever parked here for more than the legal limit. That's not the point." "No, you're right. It's not the point." Michael looked around at his gathering congregation, at the faces of people who'd come to worship and instead found themselves witnessing a public humiliation of their spiritual leader. "The point is that you've decided to make an example of me, and you're going to do it in front of my entire congregation." Karen's smile was triumphant. "Maybe now you'll think twice before you break the law again." The tow truck arrived with remarkable speed, its diesel engine rumbling down Maple Street like some mechanical harbinger of doom. Michael watched as it pulled up behind his F-150, its driver already getting out to assess the situation. The man was middle-aged and professional, clearly just doing his job, but Michael couldn't help feeling like he was witnessing his own public execution. "That's the one?" Karen called out, pointing at Michael's truck with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just won a particularly satisfying game. "The blue Ford." The tow truck driver nodded and began positioning his equipment. Michael stood helplessly as the man hooked chains to his truck's frame, the metallic clanking echoing off the quiet houses like a death knell. By now, a small crowd had gathered, not just his parishioners, but neighbors drawn by the commotion, people emerging from their homes to see what was happening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move away from the vehicle, the tow." The silence that followed Michael's revelation stretched like a taut wire across Maple Street. Karen stared at the business card in her hands, as if it might spontaneously combust, her face cycling through shades of red and white like a broken traffic light. The crowd around them had swelled to nearly 30 people, a mix of churchgoers, curious neighbors, and early morning joggers who'd been drawn by the commotion. "Pastor Chen," whispered Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice carrying the reverent tone reserved for moments of divine intervention. Dios mío. She tried to tow the pastor's truck. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like the sound of a hive preparing to swarm. Michael could see the shift in their expressions. What had been polite concern was transforming into something far more dangerous. These were his people, his congregation, and they didn't take kindly to seeing their spiritual leader publicly humiliated, IEDIDN, single quotes, T. Karen stammered, the business card trembling in her grip. How was I supposed to know? You don't look like a pastor. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Michael felt the crowd's energy shift again, their protective instincts sharpening. He could see Tom Bradley's jaw tighten, could see Janet Morrison's eyes narrow with the particular fury of someone who'd just witnessed a profound injustice. And what exactly is a pastor supposed to look like? Asked a new voice. Michael turned to see Sarah Washington stepping forward, her Sunday dress already pristine despite the early hour. Sarah was a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years managing unruly teenagers, and she had the kind of quiet authority that could silence a room with a single look. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I just meant, he's so young, and he drives a truck, and ... double quotes, and what? Sarah's voice was silk over steel. You thought pastors only come in one flavor, old and white and driving sedans. The racial implication hung in the air like smoke. Michael felt his stomach tighten. He'd encountered subtle prejudice before the surprised looks when he was introduced. As Pastor Chen, the occasional comment about his exotic appearance, the way some people seemed to expect him to be foreign despite his perfectly American accent. But it was rare for someone to be quite so obvious about it. That's not what I meant, Karen protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I just... This whole neighborhood has changed. People don't have the same respect anymore. Respect? The word came from old Mr. Peterson, who'd been silent until now. At 83, he was one of the founding members of Grace Community, and his voice carried the weight of decades of Sunday mornings. You want to talk about respect? You just tried to publicly humiliate a man who spent 3 years caring for this community, a man who's baptized babies, married young couples, and held the hands of dying grandmothers, and you did it because you don't like where he parks his truck. Karen looked around desperately, as if searching for an ally in the growing crowd, but the faces staring back at her were uniformly hostile now. Even the tow truck driver, who'd finished unhooking Michael's truck, was shaking his head in disgust. Look, I'm sorry, okay? Karen said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. I made a mistake. I'll just... I'll go home now. Voice from the back of the crowd. Michael turned to see David Kim, one of his newer parishioners, pushing through the group with his phone held high. I don't think so. This is too good not to share. Michael's heart sank. David was a social media enthusiast who documented everything, and his Instagram account had thousands of followers. The last thing Michael wanted was for this confrontation to go viral. David, please, Michael said quietly. Let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be. But David was already typing, his fingers flying across his phone's screen. Are you kidding me? This is perfect. Karen tries to tow pastor's truck during church service. This is going to be huge. Karen's face went ashen. You can't post that. That's invasion of privacy. Actually, said Janet Morrison with the precise authority of someone who worked in government, this is a public street and a public incident. There's no expectation of privacy here. Besides, added Tom Bradley, you seemed pretty eager to make this public when you were calling the tow truck and making a scene in front of the whole neighborhood. The tow truck driver cleared his throat. Folks, I'm going to head out now. No violation, no tow. But I do want to say, he looked directly at Karen. Lady, you might want to think about apologizing to this man. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen someone try to abuse the system quite so blatantly. He climbed back into his truck, shaking his head. As the diesel engine roared to life, Karen seemed to realize that her public humiliation was far from over. The crowd was growing larger, and more phones were appearing, held by people eager to document what was clearly becoming a community event. Please, Karen said, her voice breaking. I said I was sorry. Can't we just forget about this? Forget about it. Sarah Washington's laugh was sharp. Honey, You just tried to ruin a Sunday morning service because you don't like where people park. You called the city with false complaints, harassed a man of God, and made a spectacle of yourself in front of half the neighborhood. Want us to forget about it?" "I didn't know he was a pastor," Karen repeated, as if that somehow made her behavior acceptable. "So what?" The question came from Maria Santos, a young mother who attended services with her 3 small children. "You think it's okay to treat people badly as long as they're not religious leaders? You think regular people deserve to be humiliated and harassed?" Karen's face crumpled. "That's not, I didn't mean, ... Double quotes, what did you mean?" Michael asked quietly. The crowd fell silent, all attention focused on him. "Because I'm genuinely curious. You said you've been calling the city about parking problems. You said you've lived here for 15 years and you know what goes on in this neighborhood. So I'm wondering, what exactly did you think was happening here every Sunday morning?" Karen's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Around her, the crowd waited with the patience of people who knew they were about to witness something significant. "I thought, ... double quotes," she finally whispered. "I thought you were just ... people, regular people who didn't care about property values, or quiet neighborhoods, or..." "People," Michael repeated, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Just people, as if that would somehow make your behavior acceptable." The crowd's murmur grew louder, a sound like distant thunder. Michael could see the anger in their faces, the righteous indignation of a community that had just watched one of their own be attacked for no reason other than spite and prejudice. "You know what the beautiful thing is?" Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "You're absolutely right. We are just people, regular people who come together every Sunday to worship, to support each other, to try to make this community a little bit better. And you decided that was somehow a problem worth destroying." Karen looked around desperately, but there was no escape now. The crowd had formed a loose circle around her, not threatening, but clearly unwilling to let her simply walk away from what she'd done. "I want to know something," said a new voice. Michael turned to see Detective Ray Morgan, still in his jogging clothes, but clearly identifying himself as law enforcement. "Ma'am, you called for this truck to be towed. Did you contact the city first to verify there was actually a parking violation?" Karen's face went pale. I thought..." "That's not what I asked," Ray said firmly. "Did you contact the city to verify there was a parking violation before you called for the tow?" "No," Karen whispered. "So you knowingly called for the towing of a legally parked vehicle," Ray continued. "That's filing a false report, which is a misdemeanor. And since you did it specifically to harass someone, it could be considered harassment as well." The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word. Karen looked like she was about to faint. "I could arrest you right now," Ray continued, "but since this is Sunday morning and Pastor Chen seems like a reasonable man, I'm going to give you a chance to make this right." All eyes turned to Michael. He could feel the weight of the moment, the expectation of his congregation that he would somehow balance justice with mercy, that he would find a way to address Karen's behavior without stooping to her level. "What do you think would make this right?" he asked Karen directly. Karen's voice was barely audible. "I don't know." "Well, let me make a suggestion," Michael said. "You've spent the morning trying to humiliate me in front of my congregation. You've disrupted what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning. You've made false reports to the city and called for the illegal towing of my vehicle. And you've done it all because you don't like the idea of people gathering to worship in your neighborhood." Karen nodded miserably. "So here's what I think would make it right," Michael continued. "I think you should come to church with us today." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she breathed. "Come to church," Michael repeated. "Come see what we actually do here. Meet the people you've been so concerned about. See for yourself whether we're really the neighborhood menace you think we are." Karen looked around at the faces surrounding her faces that had been hostile moments before, but were now showing curiosity, interest, even a... The Sanctuary of Grace Community Church had never felt smaller. Karen Hutchinson stood in the doorway, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she clutched her purse like a shield. The wooden pews stretched before her, filled with faces that had witnessed her public humiliation just 30 minutes earlier. Every eye in the room seemed to be fixed on her, and the collective weight of their attention made her feel like she was drowning in judgment. "Right this way, Mrs. Hutchinson," Michael said. his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to welcoming strangers. But there was something else in his tone, a note of satisfaction that made Karen's stomach churn. "We have a seat reserved for you." The seat, as it turned out, was in the front row. Of course it was. Karen had attended church sporadically throughout her life, usually during Christmas or Easter when social obligation demanded it, and she knew enough about church politics to understand what was happening. This wasn't hospitality. She was being put on display. The walk down the center aisle felt like a death march. Karen could hear the whispers following her, could feel the stares burning into her back. Someone's phone camera clicked, and she realized with horror that her humiliation was being documented in real time. By evening, she'd probably be a viral sensation, the woman who tried to tow the pastor's truck. "Here we are," Michael said, gesturing to the front pew with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Best seat in the house." Karen sank into the wooden pew, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The church was packed. She'd never seen so many people in one place on a Sunday morning. Word had clearly spread about the morning's events, and it seemed like half the town had shown up to witness her comeuppance. To her left sat Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who'd crossed herself during the confrontation. The woman's rosary. Beads clicked softly as she whispered prayers, occasionally glancing at Karen with what might have been pity. To her right, a young family had squeezed together to make room, their 3 small children staring at her with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. "Mike's truck." "She, Isabella," the mother replied, but her voice carried clearly enough for Karen to hear. She'd been reduced to a cautionary tale, the mean lady who'd become the subject of children's whispers. Behind her, she could hear the continued murmur of conversation, her name mentioned in hushed tones that somehow made it worse than if people had simply spoken openly. The organ began to play, its deep notes filling the sanctuary with a hymn Karen vaguely recognized from her childhood. The congregation rose as one, their voices joining in harmony that should have been beautiful but instead felt like a wall of sound closing in around her. She remained seated, unsure of the words, unsure of her place in this ritual of communal worship. "Please stand," Michael said from the pulpit, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "All are welcome to participate in our service today." The emphasis on all was unmistakable. Karen stood reluctantly. The hymn was Amazing Grace, and as the familiar words washed over her, she felt something crack inside her chest. The congregation sang with genuine fervor, their voices creating a tapestry of faith that made her feel like an intruder in a sacred space. When the hymn ended, Michael stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his youth, with the confidence of a man speaking on behalf of something greater than himself. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary without amplification. "We gather today in the spirit of community, of forgiveness, and of understanding. We come together not because we're perfect, but because we recognize our need for grace." Karen felt the word grace like a physical blow. She understood now why he'd chosen this particular hymn. This wasn't just a church service. It was a masterclass in public accountability. "This morning," Michael continued, "we were reminded that we live in a world where people make assumptions about each other, where we judge based on appearance, on preconceptions, on fear of what we don't understand." The congregation was silent now, hanging on his every word. Karen could feel their attention like heat on her back, could sense their collective understanding of exactly what he was referring to. "Some of you witnessed an unfortunate incident this morning," Michael said, his eyes finding Karen's across the sanctuary, "a misunderstanding that escalated into something none of us wanted to see. But I want you to know that moments like these are exactly why we gather here every Sunday." Gripped to land on the floor with a soft thud. Several people turned to look, and she felt her face flush with renewed embarrassment. "You see," Michael continued, beginning to pace slowly across the platform, "it's easy to love people who are already part of our community. Test of our faith comes when we're challenged by those who don't." He paused, letting his words settle over the congregation like dust. "Ethnicity, someone who decided that I didn't belong in this neighborhood, that my congregation didn't deserve the same respect as other members of this community, to sink through the floor and never have to face these people again." But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the truth of what she'd done. "And I have to admit," Michael said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "my first instinct wasn't very Christian. My first instinct was anger, righteous indignation, the desire to put this person in their place, to make them understand the magnitude of their mistake." Karen's eyes filled with tears. She could hear the pain in his voice, could understand for the first time how deeply she'd wounded him. It hadn't been just a parking dispute. It had been a public attack on his character, his worthiness to lead this community. "But then I remembered something," Michael continued. "I remembered that we're all broken people in need of grace, that my job isn't to punish people for their mistakes, it's to help them find a path to redemption." He turned to face Karen directly, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Compassion. "Mrs. Hutchinson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "would you please stand?" Karen's legs barely functioned, but she managed to rise from the pew. The congregation's attention focused on her like a spotlight, and she felt exposed in a way she'd never experienced before. "I want to thank you," Michael said, "for reminding us all of something important today." Karen's mouth fell open. "Thank her." "Out to our neighbors, of making sure everyone feels welcome and included. You reminded us that there are people right here in our neighborhood who don't understand what we're about, who see us as outsiders or troublemakers." The congregation began to murmur softly, a sound of agreement and understanding. "And most importantly," Michael continued, "you reminded us that grace isn't just a concept we sing about in hymns. It's something we have to practice, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." Karen was crying now, tears streaming down her face in front of hundreds of people. But for the first time since the morning began, she didn't care about her public humiliation. She was beginning to understand something that she'd never experienced before, what it felt like to be offered forgiveness when you didn't deserve it. "So I want to ask this congregation to do something," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "I want us to pray for Mrs. Hutchinson. I want us to pray for her family, for her home, for her heart. And I want us to pray that we'll all have the courage to be better neighbors, better Christians, better human beings." The congregation began to bow their heads, and Karen felt the shift in the room's energy. What had been judgment and hostility was transforming into something else, something that felt like acceptance, like possibility. "Sunday, you choose to join us. Because this is what we do here. We gather broken people, and we help them find healing." Karen collapsed back into the pew, her body shaking with sobs. Around her the congregation was praying, their voices creating a gentle murmur of hope and redemption. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But as she wept, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that Pastor Michael Chen had just shown her something that would change everything about how she saw the world. And somehow, that thought was both terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Karen's phone began buzzing at 2:47 p.m., exactly 4 hours after David Kim's Instagram post went live. She was sitting in her pristine living room, still wearing the same clothes from the morning's debacle, staring at the business card that had started it all. Pastor Michael Chen, Grace Community Church. The simple white card felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The first notification was from her sister in Portland, then her college roommate in Phoenix. Then, numbers she didn't recognize, friends. Of friends who'd somehow found her contact information. By 3:15, her phone was buzzing nonstop, a relentless digital assault that made her hands shake as she tried to process what was happening. She opened David Kim's Instagram post with trembling fingers, and her heart stopped. The video had 847,000 views. Karen watched in horror as her morning unfolded on the small screen, every humiliating moment captured in high definition. David had edited it expertly, starting with her aggressive demand that Michael move his truck, her imperious call to the tow company, her smug satisfaction as the chains were attached, but the real devastation came in the final moments, her face crumbling as she realized she'd just tried to tow the pastor's truck. The crowd's collective gasp, her pathetic attempts to justify her behavior. The comments were brutal. "This is what privilege looks like when it backfires. Imagine being so racist you try to tow your own pastor's truck." Karen energy is strong with this one. Plot twist, she ends up in the front row at church, LMAO, but it was the responses that made her blood run cold. Screenshots of her address, her full name, her property records. Someone had found her. LinkedIn profile, her Facebook page, even her Yelp reviews from local businesses. Her entire life was being dissected by strangers who'd never met her but had already decided she was a monster. Her landline started ringing at 3:30. Karen let it go to voicemail. But when she played back the messages, she immediately regretted it. Yeah, this message is for Karen Hutchinson, the racist bitch who tried to tow the pastor's truck. Just wanted to let you know that you're a piece of human garbage, and you should. She deleted it before it finished. The next message was worse. And the one after that contained threats that made her consider calling the police. By 4 p.m., there were cars driving slowly past her house. Young people with phones, older couples pointing and shaking their heads. Even a local news van parked across the street. Karen closed all her curtains and double-checked her door locks, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Her doorbell rang at 4:23. Karen peered through the peephole to see a young woman with a microphone and a man with a camera. The woman was perfectly composed, her hair and makeup flawless despite the October chill. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We'd love to get your side of the story about this morning's incident." Karen pressed her back against the door, her heart racing. She could hear the reporter continuing to speak, something about community relations and making things right, but the words blurred together into meaningless noise. This was really happening. She was going to be on the evening news. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know where you live." Then another, "Racist trash like you doesn't deserve to live in peace." And another, "Hope you learned your lesson about messing with pastors." Karen's legs gave out, and she slid down the door until she was sitting on her immaculate hardwood floor, surrounded by the perfect order of a life that was rapidly spiraling into chaos. She'd spent 15 years cultivating this existence: pristine house, the manicured lawn, the carefully controlled environment where everything had its place and everyone knew their role. Now it was all crumbling because of one moment of petty vindictiveness. Her phone rang. The caller ID said Grace Community Church. Karen stared at the screen for 5 rings before finding the courage to answer. "Hello," her voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Hutchinson, this is Michael Chen." The sound of his voice made her start crying all over again. "Pastor Chen, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," he said, and his voice was gentle. "I'm calling because I wanted to check on you. I've seen the social media response, and I'm concerned about your safety." Karen's sob caught in her throat. "You're concerned about my safety? After what I did to you?" "Mrs. Hutchinson, Karen, what you did this morning was wrong. It was hurtful and based on prejudice that caused real harm. But that doesn't mean you deserve to have your life destroyed by strangers on the internet." Through her tears, Karen could hear the reporter still talking outside her door, could see the shadows of people walking past her windows. "I don't know what to do. They're saying terrible things about me. They know where I live. I'm scared. I can imagine. Listen, I'm going to ask David to take down the video. You would do that after everything." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Karen, this morning you learned something about grace that you'd never experienced before. But grace isn't just about forgiveness. It's about restoration. It's about helping people find their way back to wholeness. And what's happening to you right now isn't restoration. It's destruction." Karen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving mascara streaks on her perfect white sleeve. "Why are you helping me? I don't deserve it." "That's exactly why I'm helping you," Michael replied, "because you don't deserve it. That's what grace means, getting what you need instead of what you deserve. But the video is already out there. People have already seen it, shared it, even if David takes it down. ... double quotes, I know. The internet is forever, and there will be consequences you'll have to live with, but that doesn't mean we can't try to stop it from getting worse." Karen heard a car door slam outside, then another. The crowd was growing. "I really didn't know you were the pastor. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I was angry and petty and probably racist, if I'm being honest. I saw a young Asian man in a truck, and I made assumptions about who you were and whether you belonged in my neighborhood." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. "Thank you for saying that," Michael said finally, acknowledging, "The truth is the first step toward healing." "I don't think I can be healed from this," Karen whispered. I think I've ruined everything." "No," Michael said firmly. "You've made a mistake, a big one, with real consequences. But you're not beyond redemption. None of us are." Karen's doorbell rang again, followed by aggressive knocking. "Mrs. Hutchinson, Channel 7 News." "We just need a few minutes." "I have to go," Karen said into the phone. "They won't leave me alone." "Karen, wait. I want you to consider something. Tomorrow night, we're having a community meeting at the church. It's our monthly neighborhood forum, where we discuss local issues, plan community events, that sort of thing. I think you should come. Are you insane?" Karen's voice cracked. "After today? After this video? They'll crucify me. Maybe, or maybe you'll have a chance to show people that you're more than the worst moment of your life. Maybe you'll have a chance to be part of the solution instead of just the problem." The knocking on her door was getting more insistent. Karen could hear multiple voices now, reporters and curiosity seekers and who knew what else. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't face all those people again." "You don't have to decide right now," Michael said, "but I want you to think about it, because running away and hiding isn't going to fix this. The only way through is forward." After he hung up, Karen sat in her darkened living room, listening to the chaos outside her door and trying to imagine a future where she could walk down Maple Street without being recognized as the woman who tried to tow the pastor's truck. She couldn't picture it. Her life as she'd known it was over. But maybe, she thought as she fingered the business card that had started it all, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. At 6:47 p.m., David Kim's Instagram post disappeared. The damage was already done. It had been shared thousands of times, saved 2 phones, uploaded to other platforms, but the original source was gone. In its place was a new post, a photo of the Grace community, church sign with a caption that read, "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose mercy over justice." Video taken down at the request of Pastor Chen, #Grace, #community, #second chances. Karen saw the post through tears, and for the first time since morning, she felt something that might have been hope. The Grace Community Church Fellowship Hall had never been so packed. Karen sat in her car across the street, watching through the rain-streaked windshield as people streamed through the entrance. She recognized some faces from Sunday morning, elderly Hendersons, Tom Bradley, Sarah Washington, but there were many more she didn't know. Word about the community meeting had spread far beyond the usual attendees. It was Tuesday evening, 36 hours since the video had been removed from social media, but the damage was done. Karen's phone still buzzed with messages from strangers, though the volume had decreased. More troubling were the messages from people she actually knew, former colleagues, neighbors from her previous apartment complex, even her own sister expressing shock, disappointment, and in some cases complete severance of relationship. "I never knew you were like this," her sister had written. Mom would be ashamed. Their mother had been dead for 8 years, but the words still cut deep. Karen had spent her entire adult life trying to live up to an image of respectability, of being the kind of person others admired. Now she was the kind of person others used as an example of everything wrong with the world. The passenger door of her Honda Civic opened suddenly, making her jump. Pastor Michael slid into the seat, shaking rain from his jacket. "I wondered if you'd come," he said, his voice neutral. Karen gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to work up the courage to go inside. I don't think I can do it." Through the rain, they could see people still arriving. Some Karen recognized as church members, but others looked like they'd come from further away, younger faces she didn't recognize. People with the purposeful stride of activists or journalists looking for a story. "What's going to happen in there?" Karen asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, watching the crowd. "Honestly, I don't know. I've never had a community meeting quite like this one before, but I know what I hope will happen, which is I hope we'll have a real conversation about what happened, about prejudice, about community, about how we treat each other when we're angry or scared or uncomfortable. I hope you'll have a chance to speak, to explain yourself, to take real responsibility for what you did." Karen's stomach churned. "And what if they don't want to hear from me? What if they just want to tear me apart?" "Then I'll protect you," Michael said simply. "That's my job as the pastor of this community, to create space for reconciliation even when it's hard." A group of teenagers walked past, their phones out, clearly documenting their arrival. One of them pointed at Karen's car and said something to the others that made them all turn to look. "They know who I am," Karen whispered. "Probably." Internet is good at identifying people, but that doesn't mean this has to be about punishment. It can be about healing, if we let it. Karen watched as more people arrived, noting the diversity she'd never really paid attention to before. Black families, Latino couples, an elderly Asian man with a walker, young white professionals, working-class folks in flannel and jeans. The community she'd thought she understood was far more complex than she'd realized. "Pastor Chen," she said quietly, "what you said on Sunday about me reminding you of your job, did you mean that? Or were you just being kind?" Michael turned to look at her directly. "I meant it. You showed me that I'd gotten comfortable in my position, comfortable with my congregation. I'd stopped actively reaching out to neighbors who might feel excluded or unwelcome. Your attack forced me to think about who we're not serving, who we're not connecting with. So I helped you by being a terrible person. You helped me by showing me where our community was failing. The terrible person part, that's something you chose. But what you do next, that's also your choice." A news van pulled up across the street, and Karen's heart sank. "The media's here." "I asked them to come," Michael said, surprising her. "Not for sensationalism, but because what happens tonight needs to be witnessed. Communities across the country are dealing with these same issues, prejudices, misunderstanding the challenge of living together despite our differences. If we can model something better here, other people might learn from it." "No pressure," Karen muttered. "Actually, yes, there is pressure. What you did was wrong, and there should be consequences. But consequences don't have to mean destruction. They can mean growth, change, accountability that leads to something better." Through the windshield, Karen could see the fellowship hall was now completely packed with people standing along the walls. Her absence was probably being noted, discussed, judged. "I've been thinking about what I would say," she said. "If I go in there, I've written it down, practiced it, thrown it away, written it again. What did you settle on?" Karen pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. Her hands were shaking as she unfolded it. "The truth, I guess. About why I did what I did. About the assumptions I made about you, about the church, about the people who come here. About how I've spent 15 years in this neighborhood without ever really being part of the community. That's a start. Is it enough?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Karen, I can't promise that everyone in that room will forgive you. I can't promise that your life will go back to the way it was before. But I can promise that telling the truth is never the wrong choice, even when it's costly." Karen looked at the fellowship hall, at the warm light spilling from its windows, at the community she'd attacked, gathering to decide her fate. "Will you walk in with me?" I was hoping you'd ask. They ran through the rain together, pastor and pariah, toward a reckoning that would define both of their futures. As they reached the door, Karen could hear the murmur of voices inside, the sound of a community wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The room fell silent when they entered. Karen had expected anger, hostility, the kind of mob mentality she'd experienced online. Instead, she found something more unsettling: curiosity. Hundreds of eyes studying her, with the intensity of people trying to understand how someone could do what she'd done. Michael guided her to the front of the room, where 2 chairs had been placed facing the crowd. As they sat down, Karen realized this wasn't going to be a traditional community meeting. This was a trial, with her as the defendant and the entire neighborhood as the jury. "Thank you all for coming," Michael began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "I know this isn't the meeting we planned to have, but it's the meeting we need to have. We're here because on Sunday morning, something happened that has forced us to confront some difficult truths about ourselves and our community." He gestured to Karen, who was clutching her folded paper like a lifeline. "Mrs. Hutchinson has asked to speak to all of you, to take responsibility for her actions, and to try to help us understand what led to Sunday's incident. I've asked her to be completely honest, even if that honesty is uncomfortable for all of us." The crowd was dead silent, waiting. Karen looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar from Sunday morning, others completely unknown, and realized that this moment would define the rest of her life. She could offer excuses, deflect blame, try to minimize what she'd done. Or She could do something she'd never done before, tell the complete, unvarnished truth about who she really was. She stood up, her legs shaking, and unfolded her paper. But as she looked out at the crowd, she realized she didn't need it anymore. The truth wasn't something that required notes. "My name is Karen Hutchinson," she began, her voice barely audible. "And on Sunday morning, I tried to have Pastor Chun's truck towed because I didn't think he looked like he belonged in my neighborhood." The admission hit the room like a physical force. Karen heard gasps, murmurs, the sound of people shifting in their seats, but she pressed on. "I want you to understand something. I didn't wake up that morning planning to be racist. I didn't think of myself as the kind of person who would judge someone based on their race or age or appearance. But when I saw a young Asian man in a pickup truck parked outside my house, I made assumptions. I decided he was probably inconsiderate, probably didn't understand proper behavior, probably didn't deserve the same respect I'd show to someone who looked more ... familiar." The word hung in the air like an accusation, and when he tried to reason with me, when he tried to be respectful and find a compromise, I got angrier. Because how dare this person I'd already decided didn't belong, try to make me feel like I was being unreasonable? Karen's voice was growing stronger now, fed by a kind of desperate honesty she'd never experienced before. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. 15 years of watching people come to church every Sunday, of hearing the bells ring, of seeing families walk down the street in their Sunday clothes. And in all that time, I never once introduced myself to Pastor Chen. I never attended a service, never participated in a community event, never made any effort to understand what this church was about or what it meant to this neighborhood." Looked directly at Michael, then back at the crowd. "But I felt entitled to judge it. I felt entitled to decide that the noise, the parking, the activity was somehow a burden I shouldn't have to bear. I turned a community gathering into an imposition, and when someone tried to peacefully coexist with me, I tried to destroy their Sunday morning." The room was completely silent, and